Hello and welcome back to Absurdity. I am joined by my shadowy, and not now hold on. This is why I say shadowy, but my shadowy co-host Henry Johnson. I could have said stubbly co-host Henry Johnson too, but it looks like you forgot your razor the last couple days. You trying to go for that rugged mountain man look.
Not going for the rugged mountain man look. Honestly, it's one of those things where I overslept my alarm this morning. So I did not shave if I was going to make the appointments I had to keep. And we're recording this near the end of our day. So it's 5 o'clock shadow on steroids.
Literally it's 5 o'clock shadow. I love it. I love it. Well, I'm excited for today's episode. If you are new here, we discuss all things absurd in religion, culture, and society. And the kind of platform or the foundation of absurdity is the idea that when we embrace that everything is absurd from different perspectives, it can help us have more authentic and better conversations. And so excited that you're here. And if you enjoy the episode, then consider subscribing. And yeah, let's get to it, Henry. So this is going to be a fun time. And
As if our last two episodes haven't been fun.
Yeah, our last two episodes have not been remote. Well, okay, hold on. Our Josh Duggar episode is in no way controversial. The topic itself is controversial, I guess. But even then, not really. Like, everyone kind of has the same position on it to some degree. It's just a matter of how extreme your position, like how far you take that position. And, you know, there are people that target just ATI and like the cult that Bill Gothard's whole group. There's some that just target Duggar and his family. And then there are others that go to all the way to like TLC. And then there are others that are like religion as a whole is a sham and terrible. So like it just depends on how far you take those views. But I feel like overall that one's not too controversial, right? Maybe?
I guess not. I mean, so what you're saying is we're stepping up the controversial level.
Correct. Well, yes. Yes. I mean, it just depends on now if you think that Israel-Palestine or this conversation about guns and gun control is going to be is more controversial. But I think what makes this one special and what is going to make this one really entertaining for both you and I and for our listeners is the fact that, well, there's one very, very, very major difference between us, and that is that I have never held a gun in my entire life. And Henry, you have a lot of experience with guns, both as someone who has fired them, grown up, you know, with them as a kind of a regular part of your life, but as also someone who's involved in kind of historical recreations and reenactments as well. So I'm excited to see how this plays out between us, and if our friendship can overcome this huge, you know, canyon between the two of us.
Spoiler alert: it can, but
maybe
that's because you know.
Check back in an hour.
That's true. I guess it depends on if we take the traditional approach where I'm just going to say, well, you know, you hate freedom. And then you turn around and say, I hate human lives. And then by the time we're done, we just hate each other.
Yeah, that's normal. So that's the standard way this conversation goes. And I'm here for it. You know, I'm nothing if not consistent. And I just want to do what everyone else is doing. I am a sheep,
right? Because
Henry.
because that's why we created it. Well, I didn't have anything to do with it. Why you created absurdity, right? Was to be a sheep.
Yeah, exactly. That's all. And
by the way, for all of our sheep listeners, you know, I'm sorry if that triggered you, and that was pretty bad. But you know, we're gonna move on.
Great. That's a great launching point. No, but I do think, so I actually want to give a short disclaimer here, which is simply the fact that, like, yes, I haven't held a gun. I haven't fired a gun. I'm unnaturally good at laser tag for some reason. And I actually distinctly remember a time way back when in high school where I was playing a laser tag in this, like, there was a whole laser tag place outside of Orlando, and they had like warehouse recreations, so it kind of felt like you were playing like a video game. So it wasn't just like those weird like sci-fi blacklight type of laser tag places, but it was very much like more urban style. And I actually remember at one point straight up like this. So imagine like this warehouse setup where you've got all these different pallets and construction things, and that you can hide behind as protection and fire from whatever, right? And get cover. And I remember at one point literally getting up and walking down the center of the room and just turning right and left and just knocking people out. And it was amazing.
Like
And I've
John
never been
Wick
able to.
Laser Edition.
Yes, literally. Except I never had to reload. And it was beautiful.
Hollywood style.
Paintball, I'm much worse at, and airsoft, I'm much worse at because of aerodynamics and pressure, different PSI differences, and all of that good stuff. But I have had the cops called on me for airsoft. Me and my friends, as a kid, used to run around shooting each other. Masks
and you survived,
on, of course,
because you were white.
And yeah, I know, right? But neighbors would call the cops. That's all right. Well, episode's over, everybody. No. But you're right. I mean, knowing what I know now and thinking back on that time, that could have gone entirely different. But the other thing that went well in our favor was the fact that by the time the cops arrived, my friend and I just happened to already be done doing that. So it was, it just made life a lot easier. And for us, because then the cop came and was like, hey, what was going on here? Rather than, what's wild is someone called about guns and they only sent one cop. So that was what was weird to me. Now that's what's weird to me thinking back. As a kid, I didn't think anything of it. But so,
you were also in Florida.
Fair enough. That's true.
The story keeps adding layers of duh.
Yeah, it's like, oh, that makes sense. Okay, yeah, all right, that makes sense. Yeah. So I have experienced that way, but I just want to say this. If we come at these conversations with the mindset that we're not allowed, you're not allowed to have an opinion or you're not allowed to talk about something unless you have personally lived it or done it or whatever, then none of us could ever get anything accomplished. And none of us would ever be able to either learn and be educated and know more about it. And I don't say that just to say so my opinion suddenly means more than anyone else's. No, not at all. That's not at all what I'm saying here. What I am saying is if we discount or take away the opportunity for people to have conversations and to be educated, because there are things that I don't know. And if we take that away from people, then I don't understand how someone as a gun rights advocate, as someone who wants, who's very much a Second Amendment defender, I don't understand how you expect to change anyone's mind if you won't even let them have the conversation or, won't take the time to educate them. And that's where I think we do need to, and that's part of what absurdity is. You don't have to have a PhD to have conversations, and we try to model that and try to come at things from an educated perspective, but we learn from our listeners all the time, and we learn from each other, and we learn, through our research. So we grow as we go. And so if there are things that I get wrong in this, I'm sure Henry will call me out on it, but I'm excited to continue learning and continue and being more and more educated, and I'm excited for whatever kind of humility and whatever we can model in this conversation too. So just want to give that short disclaimer as we enter into this conversation. So with that, Henry, you want to give us the kind of launching point for why we're having this conversation?
Oh, right. I mean, other than the fact that in North America, especially in the last couple of years, it seems like every other time you turn around, there's a story related to guns or gun violence in the media, obviously. So in one sense, you could say, well, this is always a topic that's relevant to talk about right now because it just comes up all of the time. But recently, and I'm sure there's a number of factors why, and probably several of them political optics and whatnot, but several states have been moving towards acting out legislatively some of the beliefs they hold or different parties hold about weaponry. And that's nothing new. It just seems that some of the policies and laws or lack thereof now that are coming into force are just reaching points of extremity, which I guess is the polarization of politics as a whole. And the one that really got our attention, or the two probably that got our attention, were two states, in this case, Texas and then South Carolina, which is the state that I reside in. And Ryan, you used to live in as well, have both passed or are about to pass, as of the time we were recording this, a couple different adjustments to their gun legislation or gun laws at the state level. Most people don't realize that most firearms laws are regulated at the state level. We are in a federal system. So now the federal government does regulate certain areas of firearms and certain things about firearm purchases and things like that. But the majority of laws as to how you can handle or purchase or register or conceal or whatever with your firearms are going to be happening at a state level. So each state is kind of a patchwork of what they decide. And to that end, one of the political debates that have happened a lot more in gun communities lately and got our attention was Texas, as the time we are recording this. So the 25th of May has passed what they, both through their state house and Senate, a constitutional carry provision. Now, I'm not even going to get into the details fully of what that loaded term, but basically, in short, as I understand it, constitutional carry is the idea most people around guns have heard. The Second Amendment of the United States Constitution, which talks about the right to keep and bear arms. Well, in the gun lobbies, in the gun realm, when you hear terms like constitutional carry, it comes from a subset of the gun culture that says, well, the Constitution says I have a right to have anything and everything, and that any form of regulation whatsoever is an infringement of that right. And so any law or repeal of laws that can get me closer to constitutionality is going to be good for me. And so kind of the heading for that, and I know it's a very broad use of the term. I know there's more specifics under that, but it's idea of constitutional carry, all right, that I don't have to ask the permission of the government at any level for the right to carry a weapon of any kind. So Texas, as of today, passed House Bill 1927, which, interestingly enough, that's a whole different story about what that year brings to my mind about guns. But anyway, and it nixes the requirement for Texas residents to have to obtain a license to carry a handgun. So basically, it encompasses a lot of different things. Some you might call open carry, which is the idea that now you can walk around anywhere that doesn't specifically say, no weapons allowed, and you can carry a firearm visible to everybody in a holster or whatnot, or out of a holster. You've seen a lot of people doing this in Texas in the last couple of years with rifles and other things. We've seen these at protests. There's a lot of states that have been doing this, but the idea, and the governor is expected to pass it as far as sign it into law. But the thing that really caught my attention in this vote, other than, and we'll talk about it, other than me thinking it's kind of really stupid. I just gave away my views on this. But the state senator that sponsored it, Charles Schwertner, I believe, said this, and I am going to read it with a Southern drawl just because I think that's fitting and to give some levity to an otherwise, heavy conversation that's probably coming. He said this about the bill. He said, quote, "This is a simple restoration. Texas constitutional rights under the Second Amendment, right of the people to keep and bear arms. I think it is a bill that's the strongest bill I've seen in my legislative career regarding the rights of our Second Amendment," end quote. So, but before you think, oh, okay, first he's making fair in Texas, and two, Texas is weird. Texas is actually, with this law, coming into line with 20 other states that have moved in this direction, even if they don't call it a constitutional carry kind of law, including, and as I said, my own home state right now of South Carolina. And our governor did sign, Henry McMaster at the time of our recording, just signed into law this, I think, the end of last week, what they call an open carry law, which states that but ours is a bit more restrictive than Texas. Again, it's administered at state levels, and it says that anyone that has a concealed weapons permit in South Carolina, which means someone who's gone through some form of training and been permitted by the state to be able to carry a handgun concealed, the idea you can't see it, can now carry it openly as long as they have the permit. Whereas Texas's law, you don't even need a permit of any kind. You can just, as long as you're 21 and older and don't have a felony against you. Side note, how are they going to know if you have a felony or not with this law? Anyway, you can just carry something. So the point that got us wanting to discuss this is both sides, I think this is just evidence they get more and more entrenched in their positions to the point where they go to further and further extremes to prove how anti or pro-gun they are. And it's creating an environment where on both sides, I think things are getting just absurd. So we said, why don't we talk about this?
Well, and I think at the end of this, number one, I actually need to do a little bit more personal digging, not just on this topic, but on the what matters become federally regulated versus state, regulated by states. And the reason being, it just feels like every time that there's some topic or some issue, I either find out like, oh, that happens to be Like there's no consistency is what it feels like if you aren't if you haven't done any of the research or digging into why that's the case or what things fall under, state versus federal regulation. And so that's one of those things that I'm genuinely wanting to dive in a bit more on. That plays into drug control, that plays into and legalization of things like marijuana, and that also plays into this conversation with guns. It plays into road infrastructure and public works in general. There's a lot there that I'm genuinely curious about that I don't think I've given enough time to understand, obviously, because then I would understand it. So that's number one. But number two, I tend to agree with you, and I think for me the alarming thing in all of this was actually one line in an article I read out of a Houston newspaper. And this is where I have trouble with the way that media covers things. The one thing that really troubled me was there was a single line in a Houston newspaper I read this morning that said that gun rights advocates say that they believe in training, but believe it should be optional or voluntary. And that statement is so broad and meant to very clearly communicate one thing. And I don't know. I think I do know gun rights advocates who have that position, but I've never heard them say it. I think if anything, I'm kind of just assuming that onto them based on just the way I've seen them talk about this topic in general. But the vast majority of gun owners that I know are very heavily advocating for increased training, if not, training at a base level, but increased training in order to own and operate handguns or just weapons in general. And what bothers me about that position, just as a whole for the state of Texas and for, I think Texas becomes the largest state, but there's 20 other states that also have a similar law to this or similar kind of approach. And what concerns me in this is this idea of like, yes, I understand that cars can be a weapon. Yes, I understand that knives are weapons, which knives are actually very tightly controlled, surprisingly.
Yes.
But I think that, like, help me understand this, right? Guns are primarily a weapon, right? Like, I know that we use them for, clay shooting and competition and hunting, but like, guns are primarily a weapon at their core. Is there some other, like cars are a mode of transportation that can be converted into a weapon at any given moment. But I feel like guns have one specific aim in mind, and that's destroying or putting a hole through whatever is in front of them. Do I have a misunderstanding there?
I mean, it's going to depend obviously on who you talk to. I think most in the gun community like to refer to it more as their tools. Right. Now, yes, then the question goes, yeah, okay, but what's the primary thing you're doing with this tool, right? A hammer is mainly hitting nails. You don't use a hammer to, dig in your garden. So, I mean, yeah, the whole concept behind firearms originally is they were, to help you in a weapons capacity much easier than swinging a sword or, throwing a cannonball or whatever. I mean, combustive force. I mean, they're a tool, but they're a tool for a specific point. And
Yeah.
it is to inflict force, right? Now, obviously, how do you use the force? You're using it against a deer, using it against a rabbit, a wild bear, a human being, right? There's obvious, and that's the other thing I think that obviously gets people all bent out of shape too with firearms because they primarily have a militaristic component to them. Obviously, because why would society turn down, the opportunity to fight war stronger, right?
Mm.
And most people probably don't. I would think in the back of their mind they would realize, and I say this as someone who has done a lot of historical work with firearms, and by that is I'm not a historian, anything more than an amateur one, but I've done reenacting, but I've also, for the sake of that reenacting or for historical study in a particular era that interests me the most, which would actually be the First World War. But in any case, it's part of that and being around people that own historical weapons and things like that. I've been able to study a lot of the development of firearms, not so much the laws around them, but most everything related to firearms and its development has always been a military capacity that has driven the invention,
Yeah.
right? And civilians have benefited from those developments, but so much of how things are designed, how they're implemented, the technologies behind them have all come about from military applications. This is totally random, but to just talk about the interesting things you learn. I fired for the first time. I've seen these, but I didn't get to fire this until actually probably about 6 to 8 weeks ago. A firelock. Now, what a firelock is, if getting development, this is like go back to the 1600s, and you're talking about when guns are first becoming a thing, because you have explosive gunpowder and things like this. And this was literally a firelock, sometimes called a matchlock. Somebody had to have a burning piece of rope. That was your ignition sequence. Okay. And you're dumping black powder into this thing. And when you get it all loaded, you're having to, and you're doing that holding a lit piece of rope.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Right. And you really appreciate the safety in modern weaponry now. And then they're having to, keep blowing and all that and test everything, get it the right length. And then to fire this thing, you're literally dropping a lit match into a pan filled with powder, causes an ignition sequence, a match lock or fire lock. The fire sets it off. And as part of learning the manual of arms for that and learning how to fire it, the gentleman that had this, he does a lot of work actually with Hollywood with medieval weaponry. And so one of the reasons he had this is because a lot of Shogun series and stuff on TV and things now, when you think the feudal age in Japan, like the samurai and things like that, believe it or not, Japan for the longest time used these older firearms, actually all the way up almost into the 1800s, partly because of technology, partly because of how they couldn't get certain patent rights to build newer stuff. But anyway, and he was talking about where the philosophy of how guns were used, in military applications first began. And the interesting thing was the whole idea of guns to this day, gun owners will know what I'm talking about. Most every gun is set up for right-handed shooting. Nowadays you have ambidextrous, so if you're left-hand dominant, you can do it, but most guns were always set up to the right. You put it on the right shoulder. You're doing something on the right. And I had never given this any thought. And he goes, do you want to know why everything with guns, including the first matchlock, was set up to fire and, work and manipulate on the right? And I said, well, no, I had no clue. Because of pikes. I had no clue, because prior to this, your main thing was pikemen. The idea is you have lines of guys with like 25-foot long poles with, spear tips on them. Think phalanxes and things like this. And the way that you fight in that is everybody had to leave their pike on the right side of their body. That was the only way you could manipulate it, because if you had anybody choosing which side they did it on, you could leave gaps in your line that a horse could get through. And I never even really thought about this. Again, I'm using this as an illustration of development, in that guns are really tied to military usage. And the idea is, well, all right, pikes are all on this side, so let's just standardize their use. Weapons are now going to be designed to operate on the right. Yeah. And it's beside the fact that they've developed to a point that doesn't matter. But at the time they came out, they're like, okay, they were small pieces of artillery. They had to move through. Anyway, so that was a long historical aside to your point that, most would like to use the language tool, because the idea of, weapon, that the connotation automatically they think sets the conversation in a bad place. But I would agree. It's a tool that's function is to move a projectile at great speed, right, at a lethal speed, to accomplish something, whether that's being lethal to the clay target, whether that's being lethal to the animal, or whether that ends up being lethal to a human being. It's a tool that is amoral. Is a human has to tell it what it's killing, but it is going to move a projectile at high speed to impact a target, which is why, interestingly enough, one of the in the 4 basic rules of gun safety, so anyone that has had to take a weapons course of any kind, right, one of the 4 rules is, other than the first one, which is always assume the thing is loaded, right? You'd think, duh, but the amount of people that don't think about that, always assume it's loaded. But 2, never point a gun at anything you are not willing to destroy. That is a literal rule they teach you. If you're pointing it at paper, you better be willing for that paper to vanish, right? If you point it at that metal target, it may not vanish, but you have to be willing when you pull the trigger to expect it to disappear. Right? I mean, that's one of the rules. When you point it, expect whatever you're pointing it at has the ability to disappear.
Yeah. And but the reality of that is, and I would say, don't point a knife at anything you don't intend to cut, and don't drive a car, or don't steer a car toward anything you don't intend to drive over or into. Like, I know that you can adapt all of these sayings, and I am not of the belief that guns kill people. I do believe that guns are a tool, the way that you've described. I'm not anti-gun in any significant way that way. Just to be upfront here, 30 minutes in, the idea for me is that I do believe that in the same way, kind of locks just keep people honest, right? The idea is that your locks basically just inconvenience people a little bit, but the lock picking lawyer on YouTube can quickly disprove anyone's notions that locks are secure. I very much believe that guns are a tool, and I think that even no matter how legal or illegal we make them, people will get a hold of them. My thing is, in order to both protect people who do not own guns and people who would be on the receiving end of gunfire from someone who's terrible and would use a gun for that purpose, and to protect those who want to carry guns and exercise their Second Amendment right, I do want to heavily inconvenience the wrong kind of person from getting those guns as much as we can. And that tends to be my stance. And I think what has really bugged me in the entire gun control conversation, there's two things that bug me, right? Number one, I think this one's a little bit more recent, but I just have always found it ironic for the last year that we've been in the pandemic. This is where I start getting divisive and politically charged. But I will say the same, with exceptions being exceptions, the same kind of person who refused to wear a mask in order to protect others is the same kind of person, as far as I've seen, the same kind of person who would then turn around and say that they should be able to carry guns and we should arm teachers in order to protect others. So the idea being that they don't want to be inconvenienced to protect others, but they want to feel powerful to protect others. But they don't want to feel like there's anything disrupting their way of life or their preferred way of life. And this is the second thing, and this is the second comparison I draw. And if you're watching this on video, I've kind of looked away because I'm trying to find my old tweet about this from years back, but I haven't been able to find it yet. But I tweeted about the fact that we are absolutely, for some reason, we are okay with building schools in a way that limits sight lines of people with a gun, which can only limit so much, and like intentionally built out spaces in hallways and others so that people can actually gain some cover, because every second matters, when you're dealing with an active shooter situation. We are okay with kids ducking behind desks and basically living every single day, and parents living every single day with the reality that this could happen to them in a far more likely situation than other realities that kids face on a daily basis in the school system. We are okay with that. We are okay with them having to walk through metal detectors, and we are okay with all of the kids having to have all of the inconveniences so that I can continue to own my gun. But the second someone even so much as whispers the idea of tightening regulation or making it a little bit harder, or just the idea of if we can all give just a little bit, we can all live more safely. And that's where, like, when I see that it's the kids who have to struggle, the kids who are the ones suffering, and do not get me wrong, I also think that we should be investing in emotional well-being resources, mental health resources, counselors. I really hate that the only time that schools call more counselors is after tragedy and not before tragedy. I really hate that. Okay. So I'm not trying to say that this is just a gun thing. I'm saying, why can't we hit this from multiple angles?
No pun intended.
It's correct. And it bugs me because I'm not trying to say I know people's hearts, but it just seems so wrong to me.
It's selfish.
It's bad faith arguing to me, and it's selfish. It's saying I only care about your safety insofar as it inconveniences or conveniences me. That is all I care about. I don't care how much it inconveniences you, but I care how much it inconveniences me. And that's what's sad to me, is that we aren't willing to give a little bit just to help our kids feel a little bit more safe. when they go to
Well,
school every day.
and I think that can go on both sides. I mean, I will throw out for an aside, see how much you find this fun for future arguments that you make. I get a lot of advertising for gun related products just because I'm in that sphere of life. And one of the products that's been advertised the last couple of months, I've seen several times. Are you ready for this? Is a backpack for kids designed specifically with 2 sheets of armor plating in it. That if there's a school shooting, there's a special tab you can pull in the center, and the backpack will actually split in half, and they can wear it like body armor on either side.
I've seen something like that before. Yeah. And like that seems to me like what year is this? Like, where are we and what country are we in? Because we are not other developed countries are doing just fine. Like this is
unless they're using knives in cars, but you know.
Correct. Yes. And by the way, this isn't about knives in cars to some degree. This is about a very specific weapon. But even if you want to talk about knives in cars, yes, those things are tightly regulated. And yes, terrible things still happen. But it's very rare that someone's driving through a school. So,
right. I think like you were saying, I mean, it comes down to selfishness, and you're talking to a guy that spoiler alert, if you couldn't probably figure out from the beginning of this, I appreciate the Second Amendment. I'm glad that we have it. I have taken advantage of it, and hopefully not taken advantage of like, ha ha ha, but I have availed myself of that freedom to be able to enjoy things related to firearms in my life. But I've always been in the philosophy, freedom entails responsibility. And I think the problem that we've gotten to now on both sides, and like you were saying, is that we have a philosophy as selfish human beings that anything that inconveniences me in the least, I don't want. And we have no real discussion about responsibility. And that can go both ways. That can be, how dare you do anything that inconveniences or makes it a little bit more difficult for me to get a firearm? Or on the flip side, how dare we allow anything that inconveniences me and that I might have to see a firearm or know that my neighbor owned one, right? On either side, I think it's this whole idea, you're never going to solve any discussion if it's all about you at all costs, right? I mean, that's what makes compromise inevitable. And it also means that that we don't want responsibility. We want everybody else to have the responsibility, but not us. And if that's the case, that's not only a regulatory minefield if we start going down that way, but it's not going to solve anything, because now what's happening is we're going to the extremes where we're getting rid of responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there is something to be said about I get it. If you own a gun, you went through the proper channels to own it. You have the permits, you have everything, and it feels unfair that you have to do more or go through extra steps and jump through extra hoops in order to do the thing that you love or own the thing that you love. It feels unfair that you have to do that because someone else didn't. Because the bottom line is, when you look at all these different crimes that have been committed, it's very rare that it's someone who, had everything they were supposed to have with, in their gun ownership.
Yeah, because criminals aren't following the law anyway.
Yeah. And I get that. And I fully understand that argument. And so I would love to see something from the gun rights advocates to say, what can we do to make that process harder without further causing inconvenience to those who are lawfully carrying and lawfully, operating firearms. But I also am sensitive to the reality that guns are not just a collectible, guns are not just a weapon. And I know I said that's their kind of primary function is to hit, poke a hole through whatever they hit. That's the function of that tool. But I'm very aware of the fact that guns are very much a cultural thing now. That people, if you grew up with family on it, you grew up in a rural area or with a lot of land, and you went out shooting with your families on Sunday, with your family members on Sundays, and you were really good at target practice, and you knew and grew up being taught gun safety and proper gun etiquette, and it's just been a part of your life to the point that it doesn't bother you at all. And I fully understand that cultural significance of guns, and I'm not a fan of taking that away from anyone. I'm really not. I don't think that that's the way that we accomplish this. But on the flip side of that, I also understand that guns are not a part of everyone's culture. And in the same way that if you put me next to an alligator and you put like Bindi Irwin or whatever what's Steve Irwin's son's name? I can't remember. But if you put
Little
me
Irwin.
next to, yeah, little Irwin, if you put me next to a alligator or a crocodile, and you put one of them next to an alligator or a crocodile, both of us are going to have very different reactions to that animal. And just go watch them on any talk show, and you'll understand exactly what what I'm saying here. I think we need to be sensitive to the significant reactions or the harsh reactions that people will have to guns and weapons who can't fathom it because it's not a part of their culture. And somehow we need to be self-aware of those differing cultures when we have these conversations. We need to start from a place of where am I coming from and where are you coming from so that we have a better understanding of each other. I don't think that we can have better conversations about this topic at all without better understandings of each other.
Well, and being willing to approach it, thinking the best about the other. Because that's one of the biggest struggles, and one I hope, if nothing else, out of this conversation, because people go, wait, you didn't really get into laws and you didn't get really into whatever. Well, I know this is just a conversation that we have. But part of modeling that is this. Ryan's never held a gun, okay, other than like a laser pointer thing, laser tag or laser pointer thing.
I mean, that's what they're essentially glorified laser pointers.
Laser
so that's
pointers.
Fair. That's a fair assessment.
Yeah, I mean, and a paint object. But the point is, I don't come into it if he starts advocating about gun control or whatever. I don't view him as automatically, well, that must mean he hates guns or he hates me as an individual, right? And too many of us start the conversation by automatically thinking the other one's against me and wants what's worst for me, which means you're never going to be able to have a discussion. And that's something I wish, whatever happens in the future of quote, gun debates, that we could get to a point where those that are pro-gun rights, if you want to call it that way in some way, shape, or form, don't immediately view gun control advocates as they hate your entire culture, they hate your maybe some do, but I'm just saying that's beside the point. You can only control you. Don't approach that. They hate me. They're against me. Everything I am, the fact that they're after this thing that matters something to me means they're actually after me personally. Stop thinking that. But on the flip side, I'd ask any, gun control advocates to stop looking at someone that owns a firearm, which I've run into a lot. It's easy to find the videos and the articles where they go, well, these people hate children because every time they try and defend their guns when a school shooting happens, shows they value that inanimate object over a child's life. Or, they hate my life because that gun is an affront to me or whatever. And you're never going to solve anything if both sides think the other one is out to exterminate you.
Yeah.
And no wonder we're not getting anywhere on this conversation.
Yep. And at the same time that I don't want to paint all gun rights advocates the same way, because I think, Henry, you tend to be on the more balanced end of the spectrum on this topic. Otherwise, I feel like you would have had a much more visceral reaction to what I've said. And I don't think you're hiding or withholding a reaction, because we're on a podcast and we want the views. So if you do have a reaction, I would expect you to give it to me. But I don't want to paint everyone with a broad brush, but I do think that a lot more of the vocal ones also, I think another problem that comes from the gun rights side on the more extreme end of it is it feels and it seems like a lot of this ends up being about feeling powerful and liking the way that I feel when I have a gun. And the
Which
idea
scares me, by the way. The idea, if your idea of having a gun is that it's going to make you powerful, I'm automatically suspect of why you should have it.
And this is one of the most gross and disgusting things I've seen in this conversation. I've seen it recently, actually, and I see it more and more with more politically divided conversations. But I see on Facebook or on Twitter or wherever I am, it's been a pandemic. So it's not like I've been going out to down the street to the park and having conversations about gun rights with people, right? But the more and more I see conversations about guns, I end up, or a situation where, like, let's talk about AOC or Biden or anyone on January 6th. The number of comments that I saw after January 6th or during, but leading up to as well, I actually got worried when the Parler data leak happened, because I had downloaded Parler like a week prior to that. It was after the January 6th insurrection. And the reason that I downloaded it was because I wanted to firsthand do research and understand what was being said on that platform about this. I wanted to see the comments from the Proud Boys organizers and all of that, right? And then I was like, oh no, someone's going to see my name
this
there.
This is a facade. Ryan only tries to sound center left because it just protects his job. No.
Yeah, actually, if you're watching the video of this, behind the acoustic foam is I press a button and my wall opens up to, you know, really sophisticated, you know, inner like in between my wall is just a whole thing of guns, a whole shelf. So, you know, that's just how I live my life.
You can tell he's not a gun owner. The idea that a whole thing of guns was his statement.
And what I see about AOC, what I see about a lot of people that gun rights advocates tend to not be big fans of because they tend to be on the conservative end of the spectrum for obvious reasons here. I have seen a number of comments of people saying, I wouldn't protect them with my gun. I wouldn't use my gun to protect this person who is against gun ownership or against gun rights or whatever. I wouldn't use my gun to protect them. And that is so disgusting to me. And that's where the power dynamic to me comes into play. Because to me, that says you just want to be the one who gets to say whether someone lives or dies. That's all you want, is you want the power or the potential. Because guys tend to do this a lot more than girls. I haven't seen a lot of girls do this, but in middle school, and I know I wasn't the only one, that would always picture, like, if something terrible happened right now, and guys, our imaginations run wild. We like to picture ourselves as the hero in the situation. What would happen if someone burst in doing this? You know, I would dive in front of the bullet, or I would protect someone else. And we like to picture ourselves as the hero in these situations. And it's the same, you know, it's just that, but on a grander scale as the person with the gun. We like to picture ourselves as the heroes in these dramatic moments. But it's disgusting to me to say you want to own a gun, and one of your reasons for owning it is you believe that it's for protection for you, your loved one, friends, families. And I saw this a lot in response to the Black Lives Matter protests and the rioting that had broken out as well, which 7% out of 100% of the riots last summer were or of the protests were riots. Only 7% out of them. 93 were actually largely peaceful protests. But I saw a lot of that. I wouldn't protect these protesters with my gun. I wouldn't protect a single one of them. And I'm like, then why is protection even a part of this argument? Because last I checked, the argument wasn't so I can protect people I agree with or people I like. And that's where this really, and what was even more heinous in response to the protests was that it was police that were acting violently very often against protesters, and people saying, I wouldn't use my gun to protect those protesters. And I'm sitting here like, what? That's literally the whole point, isn't it?
I thought the Second Amendment was to preserve everyone's freedoms. You know?
Yeah, wasn't that literally the point? And that's where, to me, that's the most disgusting part of this conversation, is when I see it seemingly revealed that this is more about power than it is about either protecting a right or defending rights or protecting or any of the other arguments that we are using to justify gun ownership. And those are the exact kind of people that I trust the least with a gun.
Well, and to throw it out here, because I haven't necessarily seen those comments you're referring to, or I'm sure they're out there and whatnot. I'm going to go out on a limb and probably think in the social media world that they're making snarky remarks to express their displeasure or pleasure with something. The only thing I will
hope
say
that's the case.
I would hope, because the alternative is just even more sickening to me. But even if that's said, there is the irony in that too of, again, we don't usually engage in a lot of nuance in our conversations. Anyone who thinks
you and I
a gun,
do.
Well, okay, yes, but I'm saying most people don't. We're trying to model this. The irony to me as a gun owner, right, when you were saying that, was when I hear, well, I wouldn't use my gun to protect them or whatever. Well, depending on the laws of your state, right, assuming you actually had to have some sort of training, it's not as simple as somebody's in trouble, I pull out a gun now and I go to their defense. There are several laws that, I mean, you know, when I went through my concealed weapons permit course, and then I've had to take, it's some states it's concealed weapons permit, CWP, some it's concealed handgun license. It depends on your terminology, but when I say, you know, concealed weapons permit, that's kind of the general idea. I've had to take that in 2 different states, and because I've lived in 2 different states at the age where that was a thing for me. And each state had different rules about at what point I could engage a weapon both in my defense, but also in somebody else's defense that I had nothing to do with the situation. So it's not as simple as I walk by and Ryan's getting beat to a pulp on the sidewalk. And then I go, I've got a gun. Time to protect him.
Yeah.
Right. Because there are many situations where even though that is unfortunate what's happening to Ryan, if I step in with a firearm, I've actually broken the law myself and a few other things that could, there's a lot of thresholds that have to be met before you employ that kind of thing. So again, I that's just the irony. I'm sitting here listening to that story and I'm like, folks, first of all, did you do any training to know when you could or could not protect them? But I guess they're not even at that point in their mind. They're just like, I won't do anything for them. This isn't the Wild West. I can't just walk in and be like, meet you on the street in 20 minutes, high noon. Right, you know.
Yeah. No, that is something that I actually do want to talk about education. And I like that you talked about this. I think that gives me a good segue here because I know I've talked a lot about the weakness on the gun rights side that I see, a lot of the problems and problematic arguments that I see. But the other problem that I see is from my camp or from the more extremist side of my camp that do believe that we shouldn't own any guns and that the government should come and take all of our guns, is that many people have they lack any sort of gun education, period. They lack any sort of understanding on how guns really work, which is why Hollywood gets away with like 80% of what it does, is because no one understands how gun works.
Yes,
so now that's their gun education.
As a side note, Hollywood really, for the most part, other than a few movies and series that I know in gun communities they like to praise, but for the most part, they have no clue what they're doing with firearms. Every show I watch, half the time now, the more as I grew older and learned more about guns and firearms and the mechanics, and in fact some gunsmithing, I've gotten to a point in my life where I've been learning gunsmithing. So it's like maintaining and working on these tools. Right.
Yeah.
I'll watch stuff in Hollywood and just roll my eyes. It gets worse and worse. I look at that and go, first of all, that doesn't even look right. Or what amalgamation of a weapon is that? And then if he really did that in real life, he'd hurt himself. You know, you watch some of these things and you're just like, really? They have no clue.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so I think that there has been, I think a lot of those in favor of more gun control or more regulation have done a disservice and are arguing in bad faith because they haven't done a lot of research for any of what they're talking about. And as much as I hate Steven Crowder, he has done actually a really hate his content, not him as a person, but I just really dislike his general content. He's actually done a great job of highlighting this through his Change My Mind series, where he goes to college campuses and talks about some of these and engages in these conversations
and you get
with college
some
students.
really dumb responses.
Yeah, he gets some really good dumb responses. Now, who knows how much of that's actually edited, and maybe he gets a lot more reasonable and well thought out positions and responses, but just
it's not as entertaining, so they edit them. But
correct. Yeah. I don't know. I have no idea. That's speculation on my part. I don't know. But what I am saying is he's actually done a great job of that. And a lot of gun rights advocates do when they say like, what's an AR? You're saying you want to ban all assault rifles, and like that's not what AR stands for. And Henry, you'll have to remind me of this because I know that's not what AR stands for. But I also, and that's in the interest of being honest in this conversation, like I don't remember what they're called, but I do know it's not assault rifle.
Yeah, that's a media term. AR actually stands for the manufacturer that first came up with the class of weapon that are commonly called ARs. It's Armalite rifle. Okay, it was the Armalite Corporation, and if that rings any bell, actually AR, the Armalite company, is who invented what's commonly known in military parlance as the M16. Okay, that's the military designation. They're the same weapon except for the ability to go full auto or burst fire versus semi-auto or single shot. And that kind of goes to your point, too, about education. That is one thing that annoys me as a gun owner when I meet somebody that wants to more heavily regulate them, and that's fine. They have a right to that opinion. But you'll often see the videos, and I see this a lot in the gun communities that I'm a part of, where they always love to play these videos, where they'll hold up like an AR-15, something that kind of looks, you'll see those shapes, and then they'll hold up a weapon that in its capacity to cause devastation is probably 20 or 50 times worse, but it doesn't look the same. And they'll go, which one of these should you ban? And the people always point at the one that's shaped like, the weapon they're used to in Hollywood, the ARs, or whatever else like that. And then the gun owners will be like, ha, you know nothing about weapons. It's obvious because this thing is like a grenade launcher and this thing is just a little simple itty bitty bullet. And you want that because you think it looks scary. You know nothing about guns. And it's true. Usually the people are not educated enough to know what each of these things are doing. Right.
Yeah.
But that's just it on either side. If you're going to get engaged in the debate, both as a pro Second Amendment person educate yourself, like on the Gabby Giffords initiative or things like that. Like why do they want that control, or what
Yeah.
are the things they're pushing that they think will control it? Now, I'm not saying you have to agree with it, but at least when they bring it up, be able to have educated reasons as to why that won't work
Yeah.
in your mind or whatever, and tell them like, well, no, actually, no. Right. Or on the other side, you want to go talk to a gun owner and say, no, they don't need to be in school. They don't need to be where, well, at least know enough to know which end the bullet comes out of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because there's,
Well, and so there's a couple things here that I do want to mention too. I've seen the same videos. It happens a lot at like festivals or whatever, where I've seen like a booth or a little table set up in a folding table, and they're standing there with a poster or something, and they're talking about gun rights and Second Amendment support and all of that. And a lot of them really, it just seems like, are looking for gotcha moments instead of really to change minds. And do you have
of
a
course.
moment there where you are able to, when humans are presented with information that corrects them and with information that counteracts or counters their beliefs, the brain does a wonderful job, too good, honestly, of protecting itself. And people will level this against me as a Christian or you as a Christian all the time, because they say that we do this with our beliefs. This idea that we kind of, when someone is presented with wrong information about something that they hold dear or something that they truly have accepted, they will double down and rewrite facts in order to justify their position rather than
filter it.
actually accept. Then they'll filter it in order to protect their current position rather than actually adapting on new. And that's because we tend to make decisions based on emotion, not just based on logic. And here you have an opportunity to demonstrate to someone, hey, you might actually misunderstand what kind of gun, what kind of weapons and what kind of guns we're talking about here. And as we have these conversations, I'm not trying to change your mind here, but I would love to at least make sure that you're on a better ground and better footing as you have these conversations. And like, there's a way you can approach that isn't looking for a gotcha moment for Facebook and YouTube. And that's what bothers me, is most of these seem to be gotcha moments rather than genuine conversations.
Well, and the same thing when it comes to legislation. And I'll say this as a gun owner, there's been many things that the government has tried to legislate about guns or other things that prove that even the people legislating about firearms don't really have any clue about what they're talking about, right? I mean, one thing I can think of is in our lifetime in the 90s was the assault weapons ban that has since expired. But when and it sounds good, the assault weapons ban, right? We're stopping people from having guns that could assault people. Well, okay. But when you really started looking into that, and I know this is going to be a little terminology wonky, but like one of the things that ban did was they banned bayonet lugs on firearms. Now, if you don't know, like, what in the world's a bayonet lug? It's a fancy term. It's a piece of metal that you hook a big, long, pointy knife on. So think of the old like war movies where it's a combat weapon, but a knife could be on the end of your barrel, the gun barrel. And they said, well, that's a purely military application or whatever, and that makes guns twice as lethal or dangerous or whatever. And so you can buy the exact same gun, but don't have the little piece of metal on the bottom that a knife could get connected to.
Yeah.
And as a gun owner, when you're looking at people going all out of shape and legislating stuff like that, it doesn't engender trust when you're like, I don't think the people making these rules have any clue about the things they're regulating. They have no idea. Because look, now they can tell everybody, we banned assault weapons. And you're like, it's a piece that has nothing to do with the functioning of the weapon.
Yep.
Right? It just looks scary. And you're like, but
yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I wish that we would have better conversations. And I think one of the realities around this is, and I think this is true of sex education, I think this is true of just general kind of education across the board, but I think that we need to do a better job of having conversations and teaching our children about guns in general. If you are living in a country where you are, expecting people to own weapons and have access to weapons, and you don't always know everything about the people that your kid goes to hang out with after school. You're not sitting down doing family interviews with people. Now, some people do, I guess, but like, you may have a meet and greet, but you still may not actually come across the idea of weapons in the house or guns, right? Kids don't know any better. And the first time that they interact with a gun should not be when a friend shows them it. or
Yeah,
when
if you think Hollywood and their video game is what's going to teach them about proper gun usage or function, then you are asking for trouble.
Yep. Which, by the way, I'm tired of the video game argument against guns because several other developed nations have the same video games and do not have the same gun problem. So miss me with the video games cause gun violence and violent, and, create violent, murderous people. Just go ahead and miss me with that, because that is a bogus thing that just makes it harder for us to have these conversations too. But I think if the problem is that guns are so serious, if they are found and put in the wrong hands or put in the hands of someone who doesn't understand what's going on. And we see even adults mishandle these and mismanage them. There's a video I saw the other day of a dude on Reddit a gun wasn't firing right at the range, and he holds his palm in front of it. And I guess, I don't know if it was the instructor or his friend around him or next to him, and he's just looking over his shoulder like, I wonder why this gun isn't working. And it's a black and white, no audio, but they're just both inspecting it. It doesn't work. He kind of shakes it and then holds his palm in front of the gun again and fires right through the palm of his hand. Luckily, didn't point it at anything. It was still pointed technically down range, but it's just like, that they both got banned for life immediately.
Well, first
on top of the hospital bill for that one dude.
If that is real, I mean, what kind of instructor did he have? Was this Billy Joe Bubba's,
Yeah, and I don't know if it was an instructor or a friend, or it was just someone, over his shoulder. But yeah,
they obviously knew nothing about gun safety.
Correct, but that's my point is, we need to have better conversations with our kids about guns and if your kid is at the age that they're going over to someone's house, then I feel like that's a conversation that to some degree should probably start happening. And I would say the same thing for pornography and sex addiction, because my pornography addiction started because a friend of mine in my neighborhood was actually over at my house. We were in my room unattended. My parents were either across the house or it was my grandma that was home that day or whatever. And he showed me websites, like inappropriate websites. And that was what started it. I didn't realize that was even a thing and an option. And then that's what started me down that path. And that's what I'm saying is, and I'm not saying you can't trust other people or anything like that, but to some degree, if you're going to protect your kid and allow your kid to be the reasonable one in the room, then you need to educate them. Because if they're not educated, they're going to regardless of how responsible your child is, sometimes they may have the instinct that whatever situation they're in is bad or dangerous. But overall, I don't think that many kids do. I know I didn't. I know none of my friends did. The stuff that we did it's a miracle that I was never either arrested or just terrible things didn't happen to me as a kid with how often I was out. I used to BMX and ride around my town all the time with friends. And it's amazing the stuff that we did, got away with, and somehow, that's one of the reasons I know God is real, because I'm somehow still here despite my dumb teenage self. And that's, I think, a reality. If you're going to live in a country that has that has gun rights and understanding the folly and mismanagement that people have and the honest mistakes that people have, we need to educate our kids and educate each other about them, proper handling, what to do if you ever see a gun unattended, and leave it alone. Or leave the room. Just don't even, you are leaving immediately if you are at a friend's house and you guys find a gun somewhere. This isn't and there needs to be that safety of, if your kid is in trouble and and they know they were doing something wrong, you need to have some sort of safe word or something that they can call you for help, and they're not going to face consequences the same way for it. They need to know that it's okay to call you and ask for help and know that they're not going to get in trouble, because the threat of being in trouble and being punished often keeps a lot of kids in bad situations. And that's where I think the education is a reality that we need to face. And I think it's something that needs to happen on a grander scale, both in the education system and starting in the home. So anyway, that's my big kind of soapbox for that. And I'm saying that for the one day that I have kids, and I'm in favor of more gun regulation, but the day that I have kids, I need to have those conversations too.
Yeah, and I agree with the sentiment behind that. I'd probably push back a little bit. I don't think training people to be scared of them is necessarily a great method of dealing with them, because I'm not saying don't be scared of them. When I hear there's one in the room, run,
No, and I'm not saying, I'm saying leave the room or leave the environment if you see it, mainly and you're with friends. That's really what I mean. Or go tell an adult immediately. Something like that. Yeah. I'm saying that what I'm saying is avoid the situation where that where that becomes a potential or a problem. You're trying to minimize the risk. To me, that's where I'm trying to say. I understand where yeah, and this is where I'm thankful for us in our relationship and friendship, because I think you understood that I wasn't meaning that, but you also understood from your perspective how it sounds like that. And this is where I'm really glad that you brought that up so that I could clarify it and we could both clarify it. Because, yeah, you're right. I'm not trying to teach people to be afraid of them, but rather to respect them for the damage potential that they have.
Yeah, just like, you wouldn't want your kid just operating a table saw without any sort of understanding about how the thing operates. And that kind of goes back to what I think we've agreed before. And I've said this, but it bears repeating again. Freedom is cause for responsibility, and responsibility is cause for morality. I mean, this is philosophy 101. And the idea is, with anything, I think if you want to exercise that freedom, you need to be responsible. I don't want the government saying that people can't have a firearm. At the same time, I do think there is a certain societal right, as much as it would probably annoy me, and as much as a lot of the things I deal with now are very annoying to me as a gun owner. But you have to have responsibility with that, right? Freedom, exercise that freedom, but show you're responsible with it. Just like I had to get a driver's license to drive a car. Now, I know all the arguments, and I said there needs to be debate about this, because I know people go, yes, there should be a national firearms license, and that really terrifies me because, to be honest, people in the gun community, we don't trust the government. The same government that passed something as dumb as the assault weapons ban, with a bayonet lug being the problem. And how many, nowadays, all the conversations, high-capacity magazines, they're bad. Who needs, 30 rounds to do whatever? And they think the magazine is the problem with the firearm. And, some of these, the same government that's that uneducated when they're going to make a rule, it's hard to trust them to be like, yeah, and I'm really going to trust you to know everything I own and what I have, and that you're not going to start some registry and just come after us. I get that argument too. But that discussion needs to be had in some way, shape, or form. Just because you can't trust them like that, well, then put in safeguards or, whatever. But at the same time, there needs to be some sort of responsibility undertaken. And I wish that wasn't the case, but we're reaching a point in society where we have ceased as a whole being responsible. And I know I know the argument on the flip side, well, you can't just legislate responsibility. Yeah, there's limits, but I don't think it has to be an all or nothing proposition. Maybe that's unpopular to say. I don't think it needs to be all guns banned. I don't think we have to get to a point almost like, some European countries or even the direction New Zealand and other things are going. But at the same time, it doesn't need to be, I'll just be honest, I'm not thrilled with what South Carolina just did with their open carry law. Of course, it's interesting to me that the police departments aren't either, and the parties that say they're very pro-police are ignoring them in this case. Or then states like Texas doing that, where there needs to be a free-for-all where it doesn't matter whether you know the backside of a gun, the front side of a gun, or anything, just go have at it. And why they think that's not going to cause a problem, I mean, you're just asking for it with how irresponsible people are. But we need to show responsibility. I'll just go out on a limb and say this kind of as we're beginning to wrap up. This isn't me just as a citizen saying, that just happens to have a few guns, but, I'm like, well, I don't like the government regulating me. Or you might go, well, you haven't had enough regulation to deal with to know about what that would look like as a gun owner. No, I do. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this. And I'll say this knowing that you won't know exactly what I have that makes me deal with this, but I am one of the a smaller class of gun owners in America that operates under something called the NFA, or the National Firearms Act. And that's a whole different conversation for another time. But for those of you who are like, what in the world is that? Just know it is legal in this country. And I think this is a great thing. You can, again, disagree with me. This shows I'm a gun guy, but it is legal for certain civilians to own actual full auto machine guns and destructive devices and other things in this country. When the media is always like, that person had an assault weapon or it was a fully automatic weapon. And I always watch those reports and I'm like, no, it's not. You know nothing about guns. But it is actually legal in this country. It's heavily regulated. This is why I'm bringing this up. To own full kinds of military weaponry for certain purposes. Okay. And it is highly regulated. It actually is regulated not at the state level, but at the federal level by 5 different departments of the government, including the Bureau of Alcohol, Firearms, Tobacco, and Explosives, #bad combo, commonly called the ATF. Commonly called the ATF.
Reach.
Yeah, because all those things together is just wonderful. Alcohol, guns, okay, drugs, explosives. So, but the ATF, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of the Treasury, right? There's all these different agencies that this regulation happens under. And I have gone through that process multiple times. Title II Class 3 weapons is what they call it for certain things that I have had access or the ability to do in my life. And it's an annoying process. I will say this on behalf of all gun owners or anyone that's tried to go through this process. It is mind-numbingly bureaucratically stupid to the point where everything I do is still in paper form in the digital age. So I'm making hand copies of stuff and passport photos and taping it to the documents, and it's ridiculous. You know, I'm going through full fingerprinting. I'm not talking about just a little phone call when you go buy a gun, the NICS system where they just go, is he wanted for anything? Nope. Okay, you can have it. No, I'm talking about the FBI is running all 50 states, figuring out if I'm a psychopath, you know, all this kind of stuff. You know, you're paying additional taxes on this thing, and the process can take up to a year. Okay. And that's if you're lucky. It's usually dragging out longer because the ATF is as slow as a herd of turtles in a field of peanut butter.
I just want you to know that when you first said alcohol, tobacco, and firearms and explosives all in the same place, what could be better? The first thing I thought of is, so the ATF is Walmart? That's the first thing I thought of.
Kind of, except if Walmart sold full automatic weapons.
Correct.
Silencers, because silencers are also regulated by this, which that's another thing as a gun owner, like, that is dumb.
That is, and completely mythologized by Hollywood. Not even close to
silencers do not keep
way.
It where you can't hear a weapon, but and they shouldn't have to be regulated like that. But anyway, all of this is to say I've gone through that process. I find it extremely annoying and extremely dumb, right? That being said, to me, it was the price I paid to exercise the freedoms I have under the Second Amendment. At the end of the day, even though I wish that system would be, well, I say this is going to be tongue in cheek. I want it reformed, but I honestly don't trust them to reform it right now because I'm worried that they would find a way to make it even worse. But my point is going through all of that. So I've had to go through that level of bureaucracy. So I'm not just saying, oh, I don't like the idea. But even going through that, I figured it was a small price to pay, as annoying as it was, to have the right I do to own certain things that most people can't. Now, that's just my opinion, and I have a right to my opinion, just like you have a right to go, that's dumb. Oh, yes. I love you. But that's what I'm saying. But that's what I'm saying. I'm someone, I've gone through that level, and I'm not saying that has to be the level of bureaucracy that everyone needs to go through just to have a basic hunting weapon or something. I don't want to get to that point in this country, but I'm saying I go through all of that, and I still have the mindset that some regulation is a good thing. There should be some level of responsibility demonstrated by firearms owners, those that choose to exercise that liberty, that freedom, for the sake of others. Does that stop all the criminals? No, because they don't go through the NFA process to get a machine gun, and they're not going to.
But at the same time, Henry, what's your? There's a factoid that you know. Okay,
I was just going to say. That's right where I was going, actually.
This is like one of my favorite things that you've ever shared with me, and what made me a lot more open to the conversation in general. Like this, what you're about to share is very transformative for me.
Yeah, and I know this is going to sound subjective, and people are going to go, yeah, but the percentage of people that have these, well, okay, this is the point. Do you want to know how many crimes, violent crimes, have been committed by fully automatic weapons owned by civilians in this country in the last, 40 years?
How many?
0. Now, if you go look at the statistics on the ATF website, there is one crime that was committed, but it was by a dirty cop.
Shocker.
Shocker. So it was a department's fully automatic weapon, not one owned by a civilian.
Privately, yeah.
Right. But so here's my point. I know that's incidental. And obviously, I suppose if the numbers in that system went up, you would have more percentage chance of somebody doing something violent with it. But I'm just saying this regulation, as imperfect as it is, it's interesting that it did enough of a job of weeding out people that, again, I'm sure there's criminals somewhere that have made their own and they're doing dumb things with it. But I'm just saying that kind of regulation, all of a sudden the incidence of people doing really stupid stuff with them went way down, almost to non-existent. Again, you can't prevent all crime and you can't prevent all accidents or all violence. That's impossible. But I'm just saying that kind of regulation, it had an impact.
Yep.
So why don't we think on the other level with just regular rifles and handguns and things that some sort of regulation wouldn't also have an impact on diminishing violent crime? I'm not saying it will stop it.
Yeah.
And I know the argument, which I do agree with, that most violent crime committed by a handgun is suicide, trigger alert. No pun intended.
Yeah.
But right. So most violence is self-perpetuated against ourselves with a gun, but still, regulation does have an impact. I don't want extreme regulation. I don't want unfair regulation. I want people that are making the regulations to be informed and to listen to the community is effective. But at the same time, why can we not have that conversation? The hardest thing for me as a gun owner is to watch at least the most vocal gun owners. I don't even want to say they're the majority, but to see the most vocal gun owners act like organizations such as the National Rifle Association, which now I'm going to get really unpopular, but I don't like them. I've never been a member. I don't want to be a member. And
No,
I
the
thought they
NRA
were
is a
corrupt before
nightmare,
that.
and yeah, they are. So that's fine.
Yeah, but it hurts me as a gun owner trying to follow the rules and appreciate guns in many different ways, to then get painted with the broad brush of a whole bunch of ignorant or just unnuanced and unreasonable individuals that think the moment you have a conversation about regulating anything, you hate freedom, you hate me, and that's the slippery slope to all guns are going to be banned, like in New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else. And to me, I'm like, that's pathetic, and it's insulting to me as a gun owner. Just in the same way as I wouldn't want people that have never handled a gun and done anything to be the ones regulating me or saying they have to go or everything else. That's what I want to turn back to you to finish this off. That's just my biggest burden.
Fine.
I don't think regulation is a scary thing. But I think it can't take place until we have responsible, informed conversations. And I mean, we've been at a point in this country where it's so polarized that up until recently, there were laws on the books to prevent any sort of funding to even research gun crime.
Correct.
Or gun violence. I mean, because they were like, and to me, that's just fishy. It's like, I don't.
That's the same with
guns.
marijuana and weed legalization, with only recently it being open to being researched by non-DEA organizations.
Yeah, and it almost comes across as, I'm so scared about what the outcome might be that I don't want them to even look at it because it will impact me. And I'm like, if you're that scared about it, we need to have a conversation, because there must be something that you and I both know that we really should pull our heads out of the sand, because, and this is what a great way to end my comment. As my grandfather used to say, boy, the problem with sticking your head in the sand is it leaves other parts of you very exposed.
Nice. Yeah, that's a fact. That is a fact. So I think I agree with what you're saying. I don't think we need to be scared of regulation. I do think we need to be wary. Obviously, I think we always need to tread carefully. And I don't want to just say blanket, regulation. What I do want to say, though, is, and I want to end with a kind of a practical way forward. So what I'd love to see, and if you're a gun rights advocate that listens to this show, which thank you for getting all the way through even my diatribes in this episode too, if you could, and Henry, I'd love for you to participate in this too. I would love to provide a list in the show notes for this episode and on the Absurdities website, theabsurdity.org. I would love for us to be able to put together an educational list of resources, a list of educational resources for guns and gun ownership that are non-incendiary. And that was very obviously intentional language. But so I'm not looking for it. Yes, it can be a biased source, obviously, to some degree. If you're advocating for a position, it's likely coming from there's bias in everything. However, what I'm aiming for is putting a list of things together that you believe that the other side or the other part of, the other side of the table would be willing to engage with and would not be immediately turned off by. And I think if we could compile a list of those, both in favor of gun ownership, and then, any resources and any educational resources on the other side of it to help understand the side that is more closely aligned with my position of not having held a gun, right? But any educational resources that help people understand the fears, the dangers, the positions otherwise and the arguments for more regulation. Like there's the hashtag defund the police, which is a terrible from a branding and marketing perspective. It very rarely do people actually mean to completely remove funding for them. What we mean is let's reduce funding by diverting that into better community care and community policing methods that prevent a lot of these things from, a lot of situations from escalating in the first place. Think CAHOOT's program in Oregon, for example. So I would love to create that kind of ongoing list of educational resources. So if you listen to this episode and you got all the way here, please send those in to us, any links, any videos, anything that you believe could be helpful in that. I'd love to compile that and do what we can to contribute to that. But Henry, anything that you would want to close with, any final thoughts from you before I send us off?
As I said, I'm all for freedom. I want the Second Amendment to stay. I want us to remember, though, that freedom requires responsibility. And there's a lot of us that on both sides that are not being responsible. And that's one of the things we've tried to do today as kind of around the place, and maybe not as specific as some people would want. I know not as in depth per se, but we're trying to model responsibility in conversation so that we can be responsible in informing ourselves. And then with that information, then seeking a way forward on this issue. And it has to be in that order. But that's what I would say. Educate yourself. Think the best about the other side. Please use some modicum of self-control and stop assuming the other one is out to wipe you out.
Yep.
Right? Because if you think that we are never going to get this conversation anywhere productive, it's just going to get stupider and stupider, which is honestly where I think our politics on both sides is going, to the point where it's ban everything or take away every common sense thing about you don't even have to be educated. We'll just carry 5 guns into Walmart on your hip. And I think both sides of that is completely stupid. And so if we want to get away from the extremes, right, it's kind of like for every mile of road, there's 2 miles of ditches and both smell like swamp. If we want to get out of the ditches, if we want to, quote, drain the swamp, now there's a repurpose of that.
Nice.
Usage, information, think better about each other, and be responsible with the freedoms we have. That's just what I want people to take away from this.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't yet, and let us know your thoughts on this episode, any topics you'd like to see us cover as well. And with that, we'll see you next week.